What if my colleagues are not people I can identify with and connect with? And being at Maxient, we all work remotely, even prior to COVID. So I wouldn't have had the opportunity to meet people in person ahead of taking the job. So I think there were some risks there that I was trying to digest. And from the good advice that I received from Barbara and others, I was able to kind of take a leap and trust that regardless of the risks, at the time it felt like the right risk and the right chance to take.
Meg, did you experience similar risks when you were leaving to go to HubSpot?
Yeah, for sure. I definitely had the same feelings of what if I don't like it? What if I'm not good at it? What if I want to come back and I can't? Spoiler alert, I did. But certainly giving up the community of colleagues that I had built. NASPA was a big thought for me at the time. You know, I had been a part of the conference committee, and kind of giving that up felt really scary. I had just finished my doctorate. So there was also this idea of like, did I throw away 3 years of education? Would I be throwing that out? So for sure, those fears as well. But also I think, like Colleen said, the opportunity to take a leap and try something new, and really the same advice that I give to my students. You know, you can try something new, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't work, and nothing is forever. Kind of having to take that advice to heart myself.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So for all three of you, and I remember Dexter and Meg in the beginning, you talked about how you had to sort of rethink how to frame your skill set into maybe a different language for non-higher ed. And related, for all three of you, what are specific transferable skills or competencies that you feel like translated very well from higher ed to work outside of the field?
I think I could start as we all look to each other. So I think I'm in a unique position in that part of my job is advising my clients on how to use our software. But in doing so, I have to use all of the experience and knowledge that I gained as a practitioner in the field. So I'm actually able to use a ton of my knowledge that I used in my job on a regular basis with my clients on, you know, providing them advice on how to do the work. So I was lucky that I didn't have to necessarily let go of that knowledge and expertise in conduct and Title IX and bit and care. I'm able to really leverage that and still talk about it in a way that helps the clients out in how they use our software. I think, but also the other piece that I noticed, one part of my background that's a little different is I was actually in the business world before I went into higher ed. So one thing that I took note of when I went to graduate school and I was working through my assistantships was that higher ed is not that different from the business world. That, you know, none of it's really rocket science, right? Anything that you do takes those soft skills that we talk about that really matter. You know, can you communicate clearly with people? Can you problem solve? Can you have difficult conversations, which is a huge asset for folks who have done any kind of higher ed work. You have difficult conversations with students, right? And sometimes colleagues. So I think those soft skills are really kind of undersold. People don't often think about how important it is to position those as real assets. When you think about the people that are successful in all areas of life, those soft skills really make the difference. So I think transferable skills are oftentimes digested a little bit too literally when thinking about leaving any profession to another. So I would just advocate for, you know, thinking about the times that you felt successful in your roles and writing down what you think it took to create that success. And I think what you'll find is that many of those things are soft skills.
Awesome. Dex?
Well, in my experience, I was leaving the world of student activities, which is an engagement type role, into a community engagement role in the nonprofit sect. So I was able to really, you know, take skills from student affairs and student activities and place them into the community engagement bucket. You know, communicating with vendors, scheduling volunteers, you know, just being able to have those difficult conversations when a volunteer wasn't necessarily doing something correctly. So it really all kind of fit together nicely when I did make that transition. So that for me felt like a really smooth, move over to the community engagement area in nonprofit. So I was lucky to find a job that I really feel like I fit into because of the experiences that I had coming from student activities.
So student activities really gave you some excellent skills in transferring into nonprofit work, because you were also working with similar people, volunteers.
Right. Yeah.
So what were some of those? What were some of those competencies, or what were some of those skills?
As Colleen was saying, those difficult conversations, that was one of them. That was a skill that I really built up working with student leaders for 5 years. I think one of my former student leaders is in this chat right now, actually. So they might be able to vouch. So that was one of them. And also really knowing how to manage people, manage a group, because I was working with campus activities board, but then when I went to the food bank, I was working with volunteers. You need to be able to manage a group effectively, really in any field. And so learning how to manage students in that aspect really helped me learn how to manage volunteers. Granted, the volunteers that I ended up working with were mostly retirees, so it was a different generation, but it was still applicable because you need to be able to communicate effectively with what the task is, how it needs to be done, and how to correct any mistakes that come up.
Did you also do event planning or event coordination?
Not as much, but some things that I did work on had that aspect. So I wouldn't plan events at the food bank, but I would go up to the community and I would table at events. So I would end up on college campuses at engagement fairs that I used to plan as a vendor, recruiting folks to join the food bank as a volunteer or an advocate. So it was kind of the flip side of that, but it all came in handy.
Great, thank you.
I will serve as a second for the value of student activities work. That's what I did prior to leaving. I'd done student activities and orientation, and the role that I had at HubSpot was really event management. So project management, which is all event planning really is, just a fancier word for it. But how do you keep an event on time, budget management, working within the scope of what you have, a lot of work with outside vendors, negotiating contracts. Those different processes were very easily moved from my roles in higher education to my role at HubSpot. And I would say the transferable skill that maybe surprised me the most was similar to Colleen, my counseling background and my ability to build relationships. I managed a team of 5. So the ability to jump in really quickly, develop one-on-one relationships with them, help them navigate tricky situations and managing emotions and things like that. Was very, very helpful to me in building those bonds with them and being able to really take how I would work with students and build those relationships and transfer it right into working with a team that I had to manage.
And I'm curious, all three of you, I mean, some of you mentioned you were recruited and some of you mentioned intentionally sought jobs, and someone had put in the chat this question that I'm asking now because we kind of shift gears a little bit in our next question, but what made you decide to leave higher ed?
One.
Well, I'll say that I had been thinking about it. It was probably a thought in the back of my head for a couple of years prior to actually leaving, just this curiosity of, I had never worked outside of a college campus, and what might that be like? What would it feel like to work maybe with people who are all of my own age? Could I do something else? And I'd always been curious about sort of corporate event planning. And then again, this role sort of, the opportunity came to me and I took the chance, but it really was just could I do it? And would I like it? Not that I didn't like what I was doing in student affairs.
Good. Anyone else?
Sure. Yeah, for me, it was kind of a confluence of personal and professional things that happened and kind of ended up at a breaking point at some point. So my kids are both in school now. But at the time I was thinking about leaving, it was about 3 years ago. My son was approaching kindergarten age. And I had been thinking about how can I make my life a little bit more flexible in time for when both of my kids are in school. I found that the school years were much more challenging than the daycare years in terms of balancing work and life. And so that was sort of a question that I had in the back of my head for years. And it was a combination of that and the sort of burning out from the Title IX work that I was doing. I found that work to be quite intense. It was probably some of the most rewarding work I did while I was in higher ed, but it was also the work that really drained me the most. And it just got to a point at this one moment where I thought, like, I'm just not sure I can sustain this. Not sure that this feels like I'm being effective. I felt like it was a no-win situation every time I handled a Title IX case. So I think the combination of those two things just kind of culminated. And I had a moment where I said, I think I need to figure something else out. I really had a hard time identifying what opportunities might be available within higher ed that would be as flexible as what I was looking for. And I knew the founders of Maxient, had talked to them over the years very casually about a potential job opportunity in the future, but never serious. And I ended up just calling them and having a more serious conversation at this time where all those things culminated.
Great. So Dex, what about you? And then really talk a little bit about, you've been laid off now during COVID and you're not in higher ed, and what's going to happen to you? And then we have a couple other questions that have come in that we want to ask people. So Dex, what was this? Did you want to leave, and now what?
So I was looking at the time to leave higher ed because I was looking for new experiences, similar to Meg. Like, is this, what is it like outside of this world? I was in it for, 5 years post-grad. So I was really thinking about, is this what I'm going to do for my whole life? Or will I not know this is what I want to do for the rest of my career until I try something else? So that was a thought that I had been having was, how am I going to know for sure unless I try something different? And so that was kind of the driving force when I was looking to make the leave from higher ed. And it was a tough decision and, kind of tough to grapple with that because I have my master's, in this. And is that going to be a waste of education? No, is the answer. It's not a waste of education. And so it was definitely, it was definitely a challenge to make that decision. But once I did make the decision, I was glad that I did. And, I was finding myself missing it. So it really did make me realize that maybe this is what I should be doing. And so, would I have known that had I not left? Probably not. I don't know. But now it's a totally different situation. It's a totally different world in the unemployment realm because of COVID. It's tough because millions of people are in the same boat at this point. I'm fortunate enough to have a lot of support behind me. And so I'm able to, navigate this not alone. But it's scary at times because who's going to be hiring when? And, if they do hire, what's the onboarding going to be like? Am I going to be starting a position in this quarantine state? But, I kind of try and flip it to, if I do, then 5-10 years down the line, that's going to be something that I can talk about in terms of, another transition when that comes. I started a job and this is how I managed that during the COVID pandemic. So, I'm keeping my options open and, looking at what's out there, not only for permanent work, but also temporary remote work that could relate to COVID. So the contact tracing, going through that process to try and get a position with that because I need something to do. And I want to be able to help while doing it. So, that's been something that I've been working through in the past month. So I've also realized that, in terms of the permanent work, I leaning back towards higher ed or a nonprofit that relates to education or higher ed, because I've found that, I think that is my passion. I miss the students. I miss the work. And so that has really also helped me kind of hone my focus in terms of the work that I'm looking for.
So as people think about looking for work, and Dexter, you're talking about being part of that process right now, and there may be other people on this program today looking for work or thinking about starting to look. Meg, one thing you had mentioned was that you worked with a recruiter.
Yeah, so to clarify, I worked with a recruiter at HubSpot. So it was a company recruiter. I did not hire one on my own, but worked with a recruiter in their organization as part of their hiring process.
Could you tell us a little bit about what that was like?
Yeah, it certainly was new. So once I applied and made it past whatever sort of first application review there was, and then once I was there, I learned about this from the other side, you're assigned a recruiter. So there's a recruiter assigned to the position, and that is the person who was my first and main point of contact. So she was my first sort of screening interview, my second screening interview, answered a lot of my questions sort of about the company and the team, connected me with my interview schedule when I was going to go to the office, walked me through all of my benefits. So it actually was really, really helpful to have that point of contact solely dedicated to those types of things. Whereas a lot of times when you're doing a job search in higher education, it's whoever your interview coordinator is, but it's not their full-time job, obviously, to be managing your search process. But it was really nice to have almost a third party, not really, but to ask those kinds of questions too. That wasn't the person who was ultimately going to make the decision on whether or not they were going to hire me. But it certainly was very different than anything else that I had done as far as a search went.
Thanks, Meg.
Yeah.
And you left higher ed and then came back. And I know you had mentioned initially, I think you were the one who said that there were concerns of, if you leave, could you ever come back?
For sure.
So could you talk a little bit about that process of leaving and returning and any change that? Yeah.
So certainly it was one of the fears that I had in leaving, and then it came true and I worked through it and, made it out the other side. But I left my position at HubSpot before I had another job. So I was in the job search process for probably 6 to 8 months. And I knew that going into that, because I knew when I left that I was outside of the higher ed hiring cycle. I was not kind of in the February to June timeframe. So I did have a little bit of a gap and I picked up some part-time work. But I will certainly say that the thing that was the most helpful to me in that process, and really is the thing that ended up helping me get the role that I have today, was that I had maintained my networks in higher education and the friendships that I had built through NASPA. So certainly there were folks and friends that I was reaching out to as soon as I left, being like, hey, I think I'm going to come back. Have you heard of anything? Or I saw this job. So those, every interview I had, every role I was considered for, the job I have now, somebody kind of helped me connect to that. So that, the advice that I have is just kind of to maintain this great network. But it took some time, and it was certainly stressful at times, but I also then, maybe wisely or not, made the decision to also sort of switch functional areas a little bit too, and to go into more of the academic advising. But I also think that my experience in the business world benefited me there, because now I'm at the business school. So I had, again, that experience, that language that I could use now to relate to my students. But it took some time, some patience, but the network and the friendships really were what helped me.
So networking, Meg, you mentioned is key in finding a position. And you do hear a lot of talk these days about the importance of networking and trying to connect with people in different ways. For the three of you, having worked outside of higher ed, do you have any other suggestions in addition to networking that could be helpful for people looking for a job outside of higher ed? I feel like, we all know, let's go look at this location for higher ed jobs. But what do you do when you're outside of higher ed? Like, where do you go? Where do you find these jobs?
Well, when I was in my search, I knew I was looking for nonprofit work. So Indeed and Idealist were the two that I relied on. And then just a Google search, nonprofit jobs plus Worcester, Mass. And Google has its own job search function. So that also came in quite handy. And then, it leads you to individual websites. So the organization websites that have the postings that might not be on Indeed or Idealist. So that's where I threw my net.
I would also add LinkedIn. A lot of companies post there, will kind of recruit through there. And I will also say too, when I was in sort of my search, because when I was coming back, I was also applying to non-higher ed jobs, also narrowing down like companies that you think are interesting or organizations that you have a connection with or are passionate about, and just going right to them and looking for specific jobs that they have, or if there's a functional area that you're interested in, kind of, if you want to do learning and development or recruiting or event planning, you can search by all of that on LinkedIn. But I found all of the vendors that we use, the company that I worked with, the companies I worked with, were all using LinkedIn for posting.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add is that networking, not just from, within networks that you already have, but actually contacting anyone who's close to you when you have an idea of what you're looking for, and tell them what you're looking for. And it's amazing what networks are there that you didn't even realize were there when you do that. Your aunt's friend's son is the CEO of yada yada organization that, is willing to talk to you now. So I think that's a lesson, advice I was given when I was trying to leave the business world and figure out what was next. Back when I was closer to college age, and it paid off, and it got me, it moved me into the direction of higher education. Actually, I did a lot of informational interviews through contacts my family and friends had, by just saying, in general, these are the things I'm interested in. So you can do it both to kind of figure out what you're actually going to focus on, and once I think spreading the word about what you're looking to do is critical to getting those opportunities in front of you.
Mm-hmm.
And I like that idea about the social network, that even if you don't think of your network being outside of higher ed, that if we think of those 6 degrees of separation, we actually have a broader network than we think we do.
I also think that we fail to look at our associate members or the vendors or the people that we're connecting with that we don't even realize. If you look at at your college, you have a bookstore, you have food service, there's software programs. They all have client relations. They all work with colleges and universities. When we go to a NASPA Region I, who are all those vendors around the room when we go to the exhibit hall? And are there bigger companies or little companies? So there's a host of places where you can look for opportunities or look for the type of work that you want. I think that Colleen's right. I mean, she didn't even know maybe what she wanted going from business into higher ed, and had to explore all sorts of avenues. And Meg was able to make a jump from being in student activities, orientation, new student programs, to business, took the words and the language from business, and now she's an academic advisor in a business school. We have lots of competencies that we learn in our profession. We just have to learn the language of how to translate them. And you can all do it. It just takes time. And it just takes, a real self-reflection on what you're good at and what you're not so good at.
I think it also takes a willingness to take a risk.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
I mean, you have to, at some point, jump.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep.
And hope it works out.
For sure.
Nobody talked about money, and I don't want to know money, but for some of you, you may have taken a pay cut. You may have taken a pay jump and then a pay cut. You may have taken an even Steven. And I guess my only question is, to what degree was that an element in your decision making?
So in my experience, I had been living on campus. My position had been a live-in position. So I knew that when I was making the move outside of higher ed, that wasn't going to be an option. So I needed to make sure that I would be able to afford rent and utilities and all of that other stuff that you don't have to think about when you live on campus. So, ultimately for me, take home was probably a lateral move, but in terms of the pay, but I was able to cover everything because, you know, I factored in that buffer of what I would need to make additionally to cover that. And so I was able to comfortably do it. But that was definitely a part of the decision-making process, was like, all right, they're going to give me what I need to survive. So that was a big part of the decision.
Thank you.
Yeah, I did a pay bump and then a pay cut back to kind of what I had been before. Wasn't the only factor in the decision to take the job at HubSpot. It was not nothing, so it was very nice. But, you know, I knew when I was going to go back into higher education, the type of role that I wanted wouldn't be at that level. I would have had to bump up a few steps and didn't want that at the time. So knew what I was getting into, knew that I could live comfortably with it because I had done it before. So that wasn't super huge, and I was smart and banked a bunch of it while I had been there. So did okay.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
So for me, it was a matter of taking a pay cut. There definitely was going to be a little bit of a pay cut in moving out of higher ed. But to be honest, I'm privileged in that I'm not the sole provider for my family. So it was stressful because we had just purchased a house and our mortgage payments were higher than what we were used to. But I think it seemed from, you know, what I was learning in the negotiations that it would end up evening out within a reasonable time frame. So just sort of took that and said the flexibility that it's going to afford our family and how much it's going to decrease the stress in our life was going to be worth, you know, taking a little bit less home.
Great. Thank you.
I see one question that we haven't gotten to in the chat about, and I don't know if any of our panelists can relate to this directly, but you may have experience with people who can, that you can offer some advice. If you have a background where there's a gap in your resume, and I think the reality is a lot of people will have a gap in their resume now because of COVID, but there may be people who have had a gap in the past as well. And how do we work with that? We're looking for work and wanting to either present our resume in a way that, you know, we're not hiding it, but we don't want it to look like the only thing people see, or questions about it.
I had a gap in my resume in between graduate school and my first position in higher education. And I had made a personal decision to live abroad for a period of time. And when I was coming back, similar to what Meg was saying before, I was coming back kind of in the wrong part of the cycle. Mm-hmm. So I knew that it was going to be a while until I had another job. So, I mean, I've always taken the philosophy of, you know, just being honest and explaining it up front, not letting it get to the point where someone's asking me. So that was in my cover letter, like first paragraph. Yeah, you might notice that blah, 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 you know, and I tried to explain, you know, in a professional way, like what were the decisions I made and why it was now that I was looking for a job. And as a hiring manager, that's what I would have wanted. I'm not afraid of gaps or people's stories or, you know, stories of failure or anything else, only because, you know, that I think is something that develops your character and helps identify who you are and what you can withstand. So I used to say to myself, well, if I were the hiring manager, what would I want to know about this and how would I want it to be positioned? And I just tried to act accordingly.
Yeah, I ended up with a gap on my resume too, from when I left HubSpot to when I ended up starting at BU. Not quite long enough to have to fully explain it in a cover letter every time, but it was, you know, getting longer the more the job search took. So I certainly agree with Colleen, like address it up front, whether it's because of a personal decision you made because a company wasn't a right fit or you were changing careers. But there are also like ways on your resume. Like one of the things that I did when I was applying is I took the months off of my job dates. I had enough of them where it wasn't going to be super obvious to, you know, so then it just looked like all the years and the gap looks way, way smaller or looks like it's not there, which is not lying. You're just restructuring. So that's one of the things that I did to kind of ensure that people would keep looking at the next few lines of my resume and not kind of stop at the first line. But it was also too, like when I was applying for jobs I was super interested in higher ed, I was also reaching out to the people that I knew there being like, hey, if you know this person, let them know that kind of like, this is my deal and this is what I'm going through. But as far as like tip on a resume, that is one. I think we're big on putting all the months, and you can just say like from 2016 to 2018, I did this, and it's true. But it also like addressing it in the cover letter that, you know, you're really passionate about for this specific role and willing to kind of wait. But don't hide it. It's not, it happens more often than you think it does. I think was the other thing that I learned through this, that I think I had this idea of like, I'm the only person who didn't have a job for a while, and people are gonna be like, oh no. And it happens a lot more often than we maybe see it. And it's feels like a big deal, and it certainly is, you know, important, but it can be overcome.
Thank you.
Someone on the chat had asked if the three of you have tips for writing a cover letter that is not a higher education focused cover letter.
That's a good question. I feel like Meg alluded to the differences between resumes between higher ed and not higher ed, which are a real thing. Higher ed resumes are a bit bloated. And that was a feeling I had when I moved from business to higher ed. I was like, what are these resumes? Because I was used to the shorter ones to begin with. But I don't know that I would suggest many differences between the higher ed cover letters and the business ones. I mean, I guess the formula I always thought was really important was just directly addressing your specific interest in the job that you're applying for, articulating why that job equals you and your role, your skills and experience, and, you know, wrapping it up in some nice way. But I don't know if others disagree. I don't know that I'm able to identify those differences.
I would say, at least in my experience, maybe the only difference is adding a little bit more focus about what you like about the company and why the company is a good fit. Companies really like people who like them. And I think sometimes in higher ed and student affairs, we look more for the skill set that somebody has and what they can bring to the role, and less about kind of how they fit into the mission of the institution or the identity of the institution. And my experience was that companies really want to see that you did your research about them, you understand their culture, and you really thought about how you can contribute not only to the role in the team, but to the company. That you have a sense of their successes and what they're working towards in the future. You know, some of these, like, I can speak for younger kind of tech companies, a little bit less formulaic, a little bit more creative, kind of, you know, less of the, please accept this letter as my application for a blah, blah role and yada, yada team, and more of a why you like the company, why you think it's so great kind of opening, has been what I saw that worked for tech companies, at least.
I actually think you hit something really important, is the culture, right? So tech companies are not, if you research the company and you're getting a sense of their culture, a lot of which you can glean from their job descriptions and their
for sure.
website. Like, you can see, are they formal? Are they informal? Are they fun? You know, what do they say they're looking for with respect to the attributes of the person, not just skills? Picking up on that, I think, is really astute, and being able to put that into a cover letter, I think, would make a big difference.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think the most important thing you can do is kind of immerse yourself in the organization that you're applying to, just so you can write that cover letter as if you've known this company your whole life. I think regardless of the field or the industry that you're writing about, you need to get to know it before you actually apply, because that's going to show a hiring manager that you're invested from that point. So.
Do you all have any tips that we haven't addressed yet that you're thinking, I wish they would ask me about this, because this is the really good thing people should know?
I would say patience is key. My hiring process, when I applied to and got hired at the food bank, I submitted my cover letter on November 1st and got offered on January 12th. So I understood that in there was the holidays, and that at a food bank, the holidays are an extremely busy time. So I had that, in the back of my mind. And don't be afraid to follow up. I don't think, it's definitely not a bad thing. But know how to follow up appropriately. You don't want to be over persistent, but you want to, keep your interest peaked and, make sure that they know that you are into it. So I think that's important too.
Yeah, I would echo patience as you're kind of navigating and trying to narrow down what you're interested in. A real willingness to look at your skill set and what you've done and do the work on how to rephrase it and reframe it. But I would also say an understanding, at least from like a tech company perspective, the speed with which things can actually move. So my hiring process was probably pretty standard to what we all may be used to, but I had actually applied for another role and then was offered the role that I got. But I saw folks get hired at HubSpot, a 2-week turnaround from their first interview to their offer, and then a week or two till their start date. So the speed can be very different and a little bit disorienting at the beginning. If you're like, oh, I'll kind of just throw my hat in the ring and it'll be a few months and I'll see what happens. It could be very quickly that you are faced with, oh, this could happen. I think those are kind of the big things.
Yeah, I think the only other tip I would say is that, my dad has always said, nothing is irreversible. Like, I'm not sure that's like perfectly universal and true in all cases,
Mm-hmm.
but he talked about it in the sense of when you're moving jobs, and you're taking a job, that you can take a chance. And if it doesn't work out, then you take another chance and
Mm-hmm.
you figure out where else to go. And I think the other piece is that you never know when that experience is going to matter to your life moving forward. I heard Meg talked about, event planning experience and how that played out really well for her in her different transitions. And I too was an event planner when I first started my jobs in the technology area, the business world. And I really didn't like event planning, and I decided to leave and change and go into higher ed. But when I joined Maxian a few years ago, I was able to help them with their annual user group conference. And I was able to provide advice on, oh yeah, that's how hotels work. And this is what these budgets are probably going to look like. And that sounds about right. And it was all coming from like 10 years plus, previously in my life. And never had I considered that would be something I would end up using again. So nothing's a total loss. You will end up learning something from it, taking something from it. And, you can pivot if it doesn't work out.
Agreed.
One interesting comment that came in on the chat, I think is speculation on all of our part, but I think it's part of sort of the conversation that everyone's thinking about right now, is for some people may be looking at leaving higher ed because right now, there are a lot of hiring freezes, that especially for people graduating right now that aren't in a higher ed job, that they can stay in and have the leisure of exploring up, that they may need a job now, and sort of wondering, if I waited out till the fall, for example, will more jobs be posted? And there tends to be different hiring cycles for different industries. And again, the question got into, is there hope that this might shift back, that could there be hiring in the fall? And of course, none of us know that. So it's a tough question to answer, but I don't know from your experiences working in a different setting. I guess, Colleen, you're the one right now in a different setting. I also assume that question applies to all other settings as well, even outside of higher ed, because higher ed is not the only industry that's affected by this. And so my guess is that we can ask this question about higher ed, but we could also ask it about other types of industries as well.
Well, let me answer it for higher ed, because as you know, many of you know, I'm affiliated with Spellman Johnson, and we're an executive search firm. And sure, colleges are still hiring, but lots of them, as you know, have put things on pause. We don't know what from May till October is going to look like. We're all talking about online orientations. We're all talking about, fingers crossed, we're going to open in the fall, but it's going to look like we don't know what our fall enrollment's going to be. So thinking about your own career path is critical, as is saving some money in case the bottom drops out. So I think everybody, has a different outlook for themselves. You're right, Melinda, we don't know we don't know, a lot of us, or I don't know anything about the outside world because I've only worked in higher education, but we can see on the streets and we can see in unemployment that the whole United States is sort of holding their breath. And, my unofficial advice is if you have a job, hold on to it. Hold on to it right now, because we just don't know, and be prepared for everything. Start doing informational interviews outside of higher ed if that's what you're looking for or you want to think about. That's okay. People have lots of time on their hands now. They're home. They'll do an informational interview with you. Yeah, but do your best at your job and make yourself indispensable and make yourself really valuable at your own campus. That's my best advice from a search perspective at this point.
And Barbara, it's interesting, as you were talking, I was thinking about when you said keep your job, I obviously that's great advice. And then I'm thinking of the grad students who might not have a job to keep, but I also think back when I got my doctorate many years ago, looking for that first job. And I really wanted to work in higher ed. And I'm a psychologist, so I wanted to work in a college counseling center and couldn't find a job in college counseling. And I ended up working in a women's prison, which all of you might think is very different from higher ed. But look, here I am. Working in higher ed. And I remember when I applied for the prison, talking to them about how I thought prison was a lot like college. And when I applied for my job that got me in higher ed, talked to them about how I thought college was like a prison. And they kind of laughed, but I used the analogy of sort of the system and how people lived there and they were dining and all of that. And so I think the reality is, going back to what everyone said, going into a different field doesn't mean you can't go back. And also there are transferable skills. And if you think carefully about when you're applying the message you're sending, that I wasn't like, oh, it was a huge mistake to go work in this environment and I'm not qualified now to work in higher ed, but I had to explain for people what those similarities were. And so I think it doesn't have to be a one-way street either way. And that right now, especially if we can predict, as Barbara said, if we could, that would be awesome. But I think, like anything, we make the best decision we can for ourselves in the moment. And but knowing that, was it Colleen? Was it your grandfather who said there's no, what was the saying you said?
My father would say, like, when it comes to changing jobs, nothing's irreversible.
Nothing's irreversible.
Figure it out.
Yeah.
I think Meg said something interesting, and Melinda, you alluded to it. If there are some new professionals looking for jobs and they get stuck, will they ever get into higher ed? The answer is yes, you will. You just have to know that. You will if you want it. And yes, maybe you take a detour and work at a nonprofit or work for a family-owned business. But like Meg said, keep your networks. Your networks can grow. You can be a part of us. Higher education is very welcoming. The people here are very welcoming. You can still bring value, and just like Colleen said, she hated event planning 12 years ago, yet it really made sense for her current job. So, be positive. You've got to have that faith, and don't give up. This is nobody knows what's going to happen. This is uncharted world events, and just keep your eyes on the prize. That's my advice.
So as we start getting towards the end of the hour, is there any final thoughts that any of our panelists want to share? I like that you're all deep in thought right now.
I think we've covered a lot of it, and really it is that I love what Colleen said, that you can try something new, and if it doesn't work, there's something else, because the skill sets that we have are valuable and useful across a number of industries. And I would say, like, if you're looking kind of for something if you're starting to think about maybe leaving higher ed at some point, like a thing that you can do now is to just start reading job descriptions of things that you might be interested in, to just start to get a sense of what they're looking for, the way that they phrase skills and abilities. And if there's something like that you're missing, that you're seeing, how can you develop that where you are now, right? Keep the job you have, but how can you set yourself up for success? That was really kind of helpful to me, was just to start to get an understanding of what would people be looking for if I did want to do something else, and how could I get there?
Yeah, I think I'm trying to think of what I haven't shared so far, but one aspect of the job that I'm in is I have more of a job than a career now than what I used to have. And that was a choice I made because of where I am in my life, how old my kids are, and what kind of quality of life I wanted to have at this moment. But, you know, I think if I've learned anything from kind of the jumping around that I've done in my career over time is that, you know, there's not a straight path to the end. You know, there can be zigzags and departures, and I don't really have any idea what I would do after this or when I would want to do something different. But I think I've gotten much more comfortable at this stage of my life with that uncertainty than I was 10 years ago. I think I would have, kind of appreciated more of a map at one point in my life where, you know, I would understand how I would progress and what was the end goal. But what I've learned is that, you know, sometimes your personal life can change your opinions on those things. And right now, this is what I need. And I don't know what I'll do forever or, you know, in 3 years from now. So I think I just plug that a little bit, especially for people that are coming right out of grad school who believe that, you know, they want to be a dean of students or a vice president of student affairs. And so there's a path and there are certain jobs they need to have along the way. I think that's a cleaner look at life than what life actually is. And I think it's okay if your life gets a little messy. And as long as you stick to the different types of things we've talked about, you know, leaning on your transferable skills and believing in yourself and your experience, your path will be what it is.
Yeah, I guess what I would have to say that, you know, during this whole situation, being unemployed the past month and applying to jobs and looking for what my next step could hopefully be, looking at my resume really gives me a lot of that like confidence. It just reminds me of all of the things that I've done and all of the skills and attributes that I can speak to. And it just gives me that reminder every day that, you know, I've worked hard to get to where I am. I'm going to work hard to get to the next spot. And it's just now at a point where I have to be uncomfortable with the unknown and accept that. And just know that at the end of the day, I'm going to come out on top and it's going to be fine. It's just going to take a bit to get there. And there's a lot of people in this boat right now. So it's nice to not feel, you know, so alone in that. So definitely just get comfortable with nobody knows what's going to happen. So, yeah.
And Dexter, I love how you just said right now you acknowledge that you're not in this boat alone. That if someone is laid off or furloughed or facing the prospect of stuff, that I think it does help to know that you're not the only one in that situation. And I think that's a good reminder. Barbara, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about Barbara's offering a group for people. And this is a good reminder if people are looking for some connection around this.
Yeah, we're providing a sort of support group every other Tuesday in May. So we have one next Tuesday, the 12th, and one on the 26th. No registration, it's not recorded. We have a professional therapist who joins us in case there are some issues that are uncovered, and everybody's welcome to just come. It's really a little more of a chat about these kinds of things too. How to look for another job, what should we do, you know, what do I tell future employers? So we hope you'll join us this coming Tuesday at noon. Thanks, Melinda.
The Region I Facebook page, you'll see the sign-in information.
Well, thanks everybody. I think that this was great. Melinda, any final comments for the day?
No, just thank our panelists for their time. Thank you very much. I feel like I've learned a lot from listening to all of you, and hopefully the people who participated, I see thanks on there as well. So thank you for your time. And just a reminder, we have every Thursday in May, there's some event going on virtually in Region I. So again, if you get on the Facebook page, you'll be able to see what's up next. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you. Stay safe, everyone.
Yeah, take care.
Bye. Thank you guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.